My name is Chris Finch, and I'm a senior social development specialist focused on governance and social accountability in Kenya and East Africa. I got into this space for a few reasons. The first, my sort of mandate or portfolio in Kenya is looking at how can the World Bank help to strengthen systems that link government and citizens. And often we do that at a very micro project level. So we work on projects to make sure that they disclose information about project finances. We work on complaint handling systems. But clearly a key piece of accountability to citizens is information available about what government's doing, the outcomes of government work. And so I was interested in data from the beginning, and there'd already been a lot of, because Kenya is relatively ahead of the curve on its data capacity compared to many other developing countries. It was an interesting space to look at. Could we look at this from a bit more of a macro perspective of how could data and how could making government data more accessible inform citizens about what government's doing, improve accountability, but even more importantly, improve service delivery performance and increase demand for better performance. I tend to be someone I like to hang out and get to know people a bit rather than just go right to the business. And I was really fortunate because in my first few months here, I started making the rounds of different folks in the government, in civil society, in the ICT community. And I just went and had a couple of very early morning meetings with PS and Demo, and we clicked, and we didn't start talking about open data, but we did talk a lot about Kenya, about what was in the census, and about what could the World Bank support, how could we help to bring out some of the stories that are in data in Kenya, and what are some of the broader things where the bank could actually be effective on governance and on strengthening governance in projects, but also more broadly. And so from that, we just started to meet fairly often, and almost always at 7 o'clock in the morning. And it started more as a brainstorming, but it fairly quickly coalesced around what can be done with data and what can be done with open data. We had a series, I don't remember how many early morning meetings that PS and Demo and I had, but there were a couple of things that happened in the sequence. One was, because of his interest in data, I started to bring some of the World Bank country team who part of their main job is working with supporting different government data sets to both collect data, to analyze data, to curate and clean data. And so because I was working across multiple sectors, I knew roughly what was happening. I also saw that he would be quite interested to see some of the work that the bank was supporting with other parts of government on data, some of the fairly large data sets that Tracy and others were working with on public expenditures, on facility level information about where schools and health centers were located, what are performance criteria around those different facilities, and how you could link those in ways that both increase transparency about performance, but that inform citizens about relative how well different government services are doing. So we started so we brought in country team members, and then we had some discussions about open data, and Alim from WBI came at one point, and he made a very articulate pitch. So one, I figured out that what Alim was talking about would be very relevant to PS and Demo, so organized a meeting between them. And Alim spoke very eloquently and articulately about what was happening with open data globally, and how it could support the things that PS and Demo and the ICT board wanted to do here. So bringing them together, bringing some of the World Bank team working on data together with PS and Demo, and that led to this focus on how could PS Ndemo wants to open up Kenya's data. He wants to relaunch the portal that was launched several years ago, but something that's more substantive, that has a lot more data on it, and they can get traction with a new constitution that's stressing governance and performance, equity, citizen engagement. The time seemed to be right. So one of the first things that we did is PS Ndemo organized a breakfast meeting with key permanent secretaries and directors from agencies that are key holders of data, with the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics, with the World Bank in a supporting role. And our country director attended, a few members of our team attended, and it was basically an initial sharing session about what is open data all about, what are some of the economic benefits of open data, because what we see around the world is that while I came into it from a bit of a governance perspective, open data actually has a very strong rationale from an economic perspective, because it's contributed to the growth of whole sectors of economies. Kenya already has a strong ICT sector, the fastest growing part of the Kenyan economy for the last decade. That said, the ICT sector for a long time has been a bit frustrated by not having access to data in digital format. Data in Kenya, there's been quite a bit of it, but it's mostly been in volume. So this initial discussion at a fairly senior level was about how could PS Ndemo, the Ministry of Planning, KNBS, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, together with support from external partners like the World Bank, as well as with some examples from the ICT community, the NGO community, of how they were already using data creatively to spark this initial discussion of, well, let's think about moving forward, let's think about pushing ahead with an open data initiative in Kenya. You know, that was a very intensive and exciting period of time, and from a professional perspective, I've rarely been in that kind of a situation. But basically what happened is, so we've been having these discussions, there was movement toward supporting Kenya to develop this open data initiative, as well as to put up an open data portal. There was recognition that there was quite a bit of curated data, some of which had been curated with support from the World Bank of government data. But there was also recognition that there was a fairly big gap, and that was that the census, Kenya census from 2009, as well as previous censuses from 1999, existed in large, thick, bound volumes, but they weren't easily accessible either to ICT developers, to the CSO community, to academics and researchers, let alone in very usable formats for regular citizens and not to mention policymakers, etc. So what happened was that the permanent secretary, and this was something I've just rarely seen in government, that after we'd had these series of meetings, the permanent secretary took it upon himself to go personally to visit different offices of government, and especially the Kenyan Bureau of National Statistics, and but just to talk about what are the benefits to the economy, to service delivery in Kenya, to equity, to some of the bigger goals in the Constitution, and why would it make sense to work together in partnership to make some of this data available in digital format. And I remember the date, I don't remember the date, but I remember the day when Tracy and I were at a workshop somewhere just outside of Nairobi, and I got a call from PS Ndemo saying, "Oh, come down to the office, I want to talk." So we left the workshop, we came down, and it was, I think, a Friday, and fairly late in the day. And while we were there, this little envelope came in from the Kenya Bureau of National Statistics, signed with a little letter from the KNBS director, Kurt Kilele, saying, "Here is the census tables in digital format, and go ahead, put it out there." Right. And this was really a very, very special day. You know, this was a special moment that I think many people in Kenya had been pushing for a long time, long before people like myself got involved. So we were privileged to be part of this moment in Kenya's history. But from that moment on, the PS had already, I think, been talking with senior people in government and in the president's office about when might it make sense to launch a Kenya data initiative. But this was really the key missing piece of the puzzle. So this data comes in, and the PS, the next thing I know, we're sitting in his office, and he's calling in different staff, and they're calling, permanent secretaries and all kinds of people around government, just already setting the stages of when can we set a date for this launch? How can we push forward with a launch? And originally, they were planning on a date in late June. I think mostly because of the president's availability, that got pushed to July 8th. And so very quickly, within a couple days after that data came to the PS, to the ministry, a date was set and a timetable was set, and there was wide recognition that this was almost mission impossible. So trying to put together a full portal in a few weeks, which is what we had. I think we had four or 5 weeks, was really, really pushing the envelope. I remember I was just about to get on a plane because unfortunately I had made reservations to go on holiday with my family, and they were impossible to change. So when the date got set, I think for a day after I was leaving, I couldn't, I knew I wasn't going to be there, but I did want to come to a last meeting that was with many of the key people on the task force that had been put together with PS and Demo. And I remember coming, I think I walked most of the way from the office. The traffic was bad. I had to get home and finish packing something. But I remember coming in, and there was just this very silent room. And PS and Demo was not particularly, was not in his usual upbeat mood. So I came quite late to the meeting, but it quickly became apparent that, and as he told me once I got there, that there had been some questions raised with the president's office of whether or not the whole launch, which had been in this intensive planning period, this intensive planning and effort for several weeks involving many, many people, whether it would go forward at all. And at that meeting, there was both this real crestfallen looks around the table and real concern that, oh my goodness, after all this, is this all going to come to naught? But also, I think a bit of, I think there was also, at least in the back of my mind, confidence that at the end of the day, that this would, that both making the economic arguments and the other rationales, and as well as because a lot of data already is out there in Kenya, a lot of this data was not new. It was data that had already been out there in books. That if there were going to be big problems because of the data, that we probably would have heard a lot more of them. So I think we were all extremely relieved. I was actually in an airport somewhere in Europe on the way to holiday to get a message actually from you, Al, and from Jay, from several other members of the task force saying, and from the PS himself saying, we got the green light, so it's going ahead. And a big relief that all that effort was going to come to an actual launch. I came into it from the point of view of accountability, but I think really it's broader than that. It's really about development. It's really about how can data help the private sector, the public sector, civil society be more effective? How can you have more evidence-based policy making that leads to better development, more equitable development, more efficient development? And data is just a key ingredient. And Kenya, because of its long traditions of data collection and data usage, was in a really good spot. And I think the combination of having a permanent secretary who was really switched on to these issues, a constitution that stressed openness and equity and citizen participation, as well as the growth of a global open data movement. And that certainly added some fuel to the Kenyan initiative. So the connections in there, I'm glad that the World Bank Institute in particular, and the local country team could help connect not only the permanent secretary, but the ICT board, the task force with some of the the resources, mostly people, who've been involved with open data inside the World Bank, which has had its own open data initiative over the past couple of years of making World Bank data open, but then connecting to those who worked in other countries that have really made an investment in getting their data to be more open, but not only more open, to be in formats that are useful and usable by researchers, by developers, and by civil society. The key thing is the context, the timing has to be right. But once the ingredients start to come together, and it's never going to be perfect, I think one of the lessons from the Kenya experience is that when you have a bit of a confluence of events, the Kenyan government made a conscious decision to take the leap of launching the open data portal before the policy framework was perfect, before the institutional framework was all what you might hope it to be. And the World Bank tends to work in this quite methodical way that says, well, we got to do step A, step B, step C. And this was a very different experience of, okay, we have the right ingredients, we have a constitution, we have the data, let's get it out there. And then we'll work around that. And certainly there's a lot of questions, and there always were in the back of, I think, the whole team's mind. How are you going to institutionalize this? How are you going to make it sustainable? But I think one of the lessons learned is when you have that confluence, then jump, and try to help bring whatever support the champions need to make that happen. And I'm glad the World Bank could play some role in helping that. A second lesson is about the role of connectors and integrators, and basically open data to be effective. And I'm not at all saying that Kenya is a perfect case and that everything is set, because it isn't. There's a long ways to go. But making open data relevant takes many different groups to make it useful and effective. Just putting it out there is not going to do it. But you need the data, right? If you don't have good data that's been curated and can quickly be put into a format to be put out as open data, it's going to be difficult. But beyond that, you need to have the institutional apparatus of how do you keep refreshing this data, how do you build it, and that's just on the supply side. You also need to have a demand for data. And what's interesting is even in a place like Kenya, where you have a decent data supply and you have data demand, that bringing those two groups together doesn't always happen by itself, right? Sometimes it takes a real conscious effort to say, how do you bring these different groups together repeatedly over time? How do you incentivize data users to not only use the data, but also to give feedback to what data is up on the site, what functionality it has? And I think going beyond that, what is the broader framework of open government in a country? So open data being just one piece of that. So I think that connector role is something that often gets overlooked, and it's seen as, well, that's not so important. But in fact, in this case, there were so many opportunities where, if different people hadn't been put together, this probably wouldn't have happened, right? So if the people working with data hadn't come together with the permanent secretary, if the WBI hadn't connected with what was happening in Kenya and the broader open data movement, if there hadn't been a conscious effort to bring in pretty quickly members of the ICT community into the task of building the site and figuring out what its initial applications and data that would be there and functionality. And these are just a few examples, but there are many ways where it's really important to have those kinds of connections made. Sometimes they can be made by government or non-government. Sometimes external actors have an opportunity and sometimes an advantage of bringing together different parties who often don't like to sit in the same room. And that's where I think the World Bank's convening power can be helpful, and I think it was to a certain extent in this exercise. So this has been a highlight of certainly a highlight of my career in Kenya, and one of the things more broadly working on in an area like I work on, you rarely get the chance to work on something at a national level that's that's of some global significance. So Kenya being one of the first countries to do this in Africa, and among the first in the developing world. It's very exciting. There's still a lot of work to be done about institutionalizing it and making it sustainable. That will take time and as I said, a lot of connections especially over the coming year, to see whether it really gets solidified and institutionalized in time. But I would do it again in a heartbeat.